2 years ago, Americans watched in horror as a crisis unfolded at the Kabul airport.
There's desperation and anguish.
More than 80,000 Afghans have since arrived in America, but this story is still unfolding. I'm Andrea Martin. In my new podcast, Stranger Becomes Neighbor, we'll find out what happens to these new arrivals in our communities. Who would help our newest neighbors? Follow us at kslpodcast.com, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else you listen.
I went back to the gym. I started training. I got my butt kicked, by all these different people. I started wrestling, and then
there's somebody out there that can say they kicked Court McGee's butt.
Yes. As a matter of fact, so I competed in almost 100 competition jiu-jitsu matches in my first year of competition after getting sober.
Wow.
I competed in 10 amateur boxing matches and 2 professional boxing matches. And in my first year, February 2nd, 2007, just a year after I got sober, I took my first MMA fight. But in that first 6 or 7 months, I had everything was going well. I was paying all my lawyer fees, my court fines, showing up to work. I was doing my piss tests. I was doing everything I was supposed to be doing. I was attending meetings. I was surrounding myself with good people.
Winning back girlfriends,
and then had a little baby on the way.
Wow.
And it was like, okay, well, you guys got to get married. And I was like, I need 2 years of sobriety before I get married. You don't know who you're marrying, and I want. And she was like, okay, that sounds good. Yep, focus on your recovery. So I was working full-time as a commercial plumber. I was thinking like, okay, now I'll go back to school. But what happened was I went and I started training at a gym, and I couldn't afford a membership. So the guy was like, you teach us wrestling, I'll teach you jiu-jitsu. And after just a couple of weeks, I started noticing that I was like better than most of the guys there. And I started to learn little tactics, and I started competing in jiu-jitsu. And I went from the beginner, like novice, beginner, intermediate, advanced, absolute division, which is like any weight, any division. And I started beating almost everybody. And I was like, okay, I got to get good at jiu-jitsu. I got to get good at kickboxing. I got to get good at boxing. And I got to continue building on my wrestling, because I was a pretty good wrestler. I was a 5A, 2-time 5A state placer, and I won a national high school tournament. So I was good enough to wrestle in college as a D1 athlete. And so I thought, I got to keep up with that. And then the CrossFit thing started going.
CrossFit craze, you bet.
And so I started incorporating CrossFit workouts with my wrestling, with my boxing, with my jiu-jitsu. And I competed all the way to a really high level in jiu-jitsu. I competed in a couple of open tournaments wrestling. And then I got so there was a Saturday sparring practice where there's all these Hispanic boxers in Clearfield, Utah. There was a 14-year-old kid that came in, and he was about my weight, kind of big, super young. And
You're 21.
I was 21.
He's 14.
14. Pretty tough, pretty strong. I had like a 550 to 570 pound deadlift. Like,
wow.
I was like
beast mode,
super.
Yeah.
And this 14-year-old kid beat the crap out of me.
He's telling that story today.
Yeah,
and I was like, okay, I got to learn. Can I start training with you and your dad? So we started training. I took my first boxing match, 10 boxing matches later, amateur boxing matches later, 2 tournaments. I was undefeated, 10-0.
Wow.
And then I took my first professional fight, which was in Ogden at the Eccles Center, or I can't remember what it was. Gene Fulmer was there, and some of the Fulmer brothers. So it was like
and for the listeners,
honor.
Who are those guys?
WBC world champion, the one who beat Sugar Ray Robinson.
There you go.
Yeah, so like a legend in the sport of boxing.
Yeah.
And he was there front row, and I got to meet him, and like I was like, wow. But I wanted to do all these sports so I could be an MMA fighter. So all of a sudden my dream started to happen from the age of 9, like, here we go. This is what I'm going to do. And so I systematically went through the striking, the grappling, the wrestling, and then incorporating the conditioning. And then at 6 months, I had a friend reach out to me who I grew up with. This kid was we had been friends. I had 2 close friends, real close friends. And one of them was an artist, and the other one was more in, like, we were all fishermen, so we all fished together, and he had struggled off and on. He was one of those 2 buddies that I used with all the way till the end, and I had to separate myself from. And he called me, and he said, man, I need help stopping. I know you've stopped. How do I stop? And I said, okay, well, throw everything away, get rid of everything. We'll go to, like, a recovery meeting, and then we'll go fishing sober. So first we went to Cabela's. We were going to buy some tackle, and he ended up getting loaded while he was in the store. He went and crushed up some pills and snorted them. Came back
there in
out
the store, huh?
In the store, in the bathroom.
Wow.
He denied it at the time, but like he had some powder on his nose, and I noticed I knew he had used, and I was like, Brady, man, part of the deal was you can't use around me, and he was like, oh, I'm not, it's my prescription or whatever, and I was like, dude, I got to take you home, man, you're loaded, and so I took him home. We kind of got into an argument, and his mom overheard the argument, and part of the deal was he had to be sober at the time to be home, and so I think they had an argument, like maybe threatened to kick him out. So he called the police and said that there was an altercation in the house. And at 6 months sober, I got arrested for burglary, entering the house with the intent to harm him.
And so he said all that because he was angry at you.
At me, and because the disease of addiction had taken over. And he thought that was his best option for him to stay in survival mode. Yeah. And I don't blame him for that at all. Yeah. At the time, I didn't no longer want to go to prison. And life was picking up.
Didn't seem like a good idea
And
anymore.
I had a career path outside of just the plumbing. The plumbing was just to maintain and pay fines and lawyer fees.
But you were starting to see that vision coming clear.
Starting to see it.
Yeah.
And I had my first fight, February 2nd, 2007. And then all throughout that year, I had 6 fights. And in my first fight, I fought in Grand Junction, Colorado. And my 6th or 7th professional fight that year. So I had 6 or 7 professional MMA fights, all that competition, all the jiu-jitsu, all the boxing, all of that. And I'd signed to fight Jeremy Horn after he fought Chuck Liddell for the light heavyweight title.
Wow.
In my first year of competition at the Vivint Smart Home
You're
Arena.
Definitely an all-in kind of guy.
All in. And all of a sudden it was taken away because I thought I could help somebody who didn't want help.
Yeah.
And I got arrested. I had to call my boss. I had to call my family. I had to call Chelsea. And I had to say, hey, I got in trouble. I have to do this. And like that was just devastating. But after that happened.
Did any of those people in your life distrust your story? Did they believe that you weren't using? Did they worry that you'd gone back down that path?
My family was like, why were you hanging out with the people you used to use with? Right. And for me, I was like, I was trying to help him.
You were trying to do something good.
I was trying to do something good.
Noble.
But I was suggested by, one of those people in long-term recovery to not hang with those people, and I thought I was different. And so that one mistake, the city charged me, and then the city dropped the charges because they thought they didn't have a case. The state picked it back up because of my priors, the felony drug charges, the DUI, all the other
This
arrests.
is where your past comes back to haunt you.
My past come back to haunt me. Then they wanted to prosecute. So I got a public defender, and the public defender told me, you need to plea bargain. Otherwise, you're going to go to prison for like 20 years. Wow. And I said, I'm not going to plea bargain. I did commit. I am responsible for hanging out with him when I shouldn't have been. Mm-hmm. But I did not do what he said. And then I had people come forward and say, hey, man, he told me this story, and he told me this story. And he'd, made up stories kind of like I used to do when I was under the influence. I mean, I lived a lie, and I had no idea what was true or false.
Yeah.
And so I got him to write the stories, and basically at a year sober, I was in front of a jury trial, and I was like 2 or 3 weeks away from fighting Jeremy Horn and a week away from trying out for Season 7 of The Ultimate Fighter as an undefeated athlete and one of the top MMA fighters in the state of Utah at the time.
Could you say this is one of your biggest fights ever?
Oh, it was by far. And in my mind, nothing mattered as long as I didn't drink or use, and I continued to show up to the gym. I thought everything was going to be okay as long as I was honest.
So there you are, standing in front of the judge, fighting for really
and
your
jury.
Life. And jury.
I took it all the way to a jury trial against suggestion from my
I was going to say, that
attorney.
takes a lot of courage because you're sitting there, and this is serious now. You're facing the potential of 20 years in prison. All of this that you've worked for.
I think mandatory
going away.
minimums, it would have been about 12 years.
Yeah, and your attorney's telling you, let's just plea bargain this. And what made you have the courage to say, no, I'm going to gather together these people's stories, and I'm going to go in there in front of the jury, and I'm going to defend myself? What made you do that?
Because I hadn't used and drank, and I remember what happened. I went there genuinely to help him, but he was not ready for help. And I remember the story. I remember walking into his house. I remember putting him in his bed. I remember having the conversation. I remember telling him that I loved him, but I couldn't help him. And if he gets sober, we can go meet in meetings and we can do this recovery thing together. But if you're loaded, I can't help you.
Yeah.
And I left. And we were arguing, but I didn't touch him, and so I'm standing from the jury trial, and that's exactly what I told him.
Yeah.
So you get the SUV moment where it's dun-dun, and the judge comes back.
Yep. And all of them found me not guilty on all charges.
Oh, that's great.
And I walked out of there, and I went and tried out for Season 7 of The Ultimate Fighter the following week. I thought my poster with me and Jeremy Horn would get me on the show.
Right.
But my interview was like lackluster and crappy. It was like everybody else's interview. I was like, this is my last shot. I have to make it on there. Or I'll never make it. And then they were like, great. Okay, well, we'll call you if we like you. So I made it all through the physical tryouts and then the interview because it's a reality television show.
Right.
I guess they didn't like me. So the following week, I went and fought Jeremy Horn, and I lost a really close decision. But after losing that decision, I thought, holy cow, I could have beat Jeremy Horn.
Yeah.
If I put a little bit more into my training.
That's
if I put
the
a little
optimism.
bit more into the fight. And I was like, I really got a shot at this. So just before that, though, I called my boss and I wanted Fridays off so I could train a little bit more and get some sparring in earlier at a gym with some athletes. Josh Berkman here, who was a UFC fighter at the time. And I'm like, I got to get some training in with these higher level guys so I can make it to that next level. And he said, Court, I can't give you a day off. You have to find a new job. And I was like, I got to take this shot. And he was like, all right, but if you come back, you can't be asking for days off. And I said, okay. And at the time, I was smoking a pack of Marlboro Blend 27s a day.
You're fighting
training,
and training.
fighting, competing in jiu-jitsu, boxing.
A pack a day?
A pack a day. I figured I was better smoking and
I feel
training
like I'm sitting next
than,
to Superman here.
Right?
Hey, if you're struggling, man, and you're under the influence and you get sober, you tell me the energy. You show me the energy you have after you get sober. You can achieve incredible things. And so that's what was happening. And so, it's like when I signed that fight to fight Jeremy Horn, I crumpled up my cigarettes and I threw them away. And that was October 27th, 2006. And I haven't smoked since.
Good for you.
And then I went and fought him, and I went through all that. I went through the jury trial. All that was done, and I was like, okay, I'm going to give myself 2 years to make it. I'm going to give myself 2 years to make it. And if I don't make it without providing for Chelsea and my son Isaac, who had been born at the time, then I'll go back to work as a plumber.
But you can say at least you gave it your best.
Yep. I could say I just gave it my best.
Yeah. All in.
All
Again.
in. I saw the birth of my son sober. And then I proposed to my wife. Now, I'm a big fisherman, trout fisherman, and I have this favorite spot in Milton, Utah, so kind of by the Morgan area.
That's my hometown.
And so I took her to this spot, and I decided I was going to propose to her. And so I tied a fake ring onto the line, casted it out, and then I was like, hey, babe, come here. Grab this pole. And she like, okay. And she started reeling it in, and I got down behind her, and she pulled it up, and it was a ring. And then I was sitting behind her with my little $248 wedding ring that all I could afford.
I'm glad you were smart enough to put the fake ring on the
on the line. Oh, dude, I wasn't about $248 was like a lot of money to me then.
Yeah,
I was
for sure.
scrounging to make it because all the fines and lawyer fees and SR22 insurance and all the stuff I had to go through. And so I proposed to her, and it's like it was like that was it, man. It was like no turning back. So I put everything into my career. I moved down to Provo, Utah, to Utah County. I started working for this gym. It was Throwdown at the time. It was like some of the top coaches and a bunch of really hardcore MMA training partners and guys that were competing. And so I started training there, and I didn't look back. And right before I celebrated 3 years and right before my 2-year mark of where I got to go back, I'd blown out my knee in training. I was having a hard time finding fights. I had only lost to Jeremy Horn. I was 11-1, and I was having a hard time making it into the UFC because it's challenging to get in there. And I couldn't find fights. I was a scary guy that nobody wanted to fight because I wasn't from a big-name gym, and I didn't have the huge fan following, and social media was still pretty new, and it was like, or for me at least it was. But I just
and if you didn't get those fights, you weren't going to be able to get it in
because you made money off those fights too.
Yeah.
I mean, that's how you fed the family.
Yeah. Well, that, and then I worked 20 hours a week at the gym, and then I ran the supplement shop, and I did plumbing side work. So I was working like 70, 80 hours a week and training full time. Yeah, I was just doing whatever to make it. As long as my family had, my wife and son at the time had health insurance, I could pay my rent and pay my car payment. I was like, okay, as long as we can do that and we can eat, we're good. And so right at that 2-year mark, I blew out my knee. I had surgery, and post-op, I had to go straight to work. I had to go straight to work like 2 hours after I had knee surgery.
Wow.
And I went into the gym. I taught a couple of my classes, and I was sitting, and I was thinking in my head because they put me under with anesthesia, and part of being in recovery is I wasn't going to leave the hospital with narcotics. I was not going to leave with prescription pain pills because I knew where they would take me.
Yeah.
But I had to go to work right after. So I went to work, and, man, my knee started throbbing and started hurting. And I started thinking in my head, okay, I'll call my wife, Chelsea, and I'll tell her to fill the pain prescription. I'll take 2 pills, but I'm going to eat first. So when I take the pills, it kind of gives me a buzz and then takes care of the pain. And then I went, uh-oh.
You could already see where this was going.
Yeah. And I was just thinking about it.
That addict's brain was kicking back in, wasn't it?
Yep.
Was it crazy how quick it kicked in?
Yeah. And I was in pain. And so I thought, well, am I taking it for the pain or am I taking it to get high? And I was freaking out in my head. And here I am sitting at work making shakes for people and teaching classes. And, and I'm like, oh, man. And this guy walks in and he said, hey, somebody said you're in long-term recovery. Will you go to a meeting with me? And I was like, yeah. And I went into one of the recovery meetings, and I met a guy who changed my life. He was able to help me and walk me through a 12-step program, and just my life changed at that time. And 4 months later, my attitude and outlook on life had changed after completing, a recovery program. And I met a guy. He walked in the gym. I'd never met him before. He had curly hair and a great big beard.
That seems to be a constant story in your story, is somebody just walking in through a door that has changed your life.
Yep. And this guy said, hey, I want to come in and go to your guys' pro practice. And I was like, do you have any experience, like training? And he's like, no, I played tennis in college. And I was like,
sounds good.
Okay. Yeah, if you come, you got to just work with me, though, because, like, there's some savages in there. And I was like, I don't want
fresh meat,
or whatever. And he was like his mid to late 30s, and I was like, maybe even early 40s, and I was like, I don't know, man. But yeah, that's sure. After the practice was over, he was like, man, that was great. I love this sport. Hey, are you going to try out for the Ultimate Fighter next week? You'd be an idiot if you didn't. And he knew my whole record. He knew everything about me, all the guys that I fought. And he's like, man, you really got a good shot to make it into the UFC, make it on the Ultimate Fighter. Man, I think you'd be an idiot if you didn't go. And I was like, man, to tell you the truth, I don't make enough money to get myself there, and I would miss out on the $500 I make a week to support my family. And I said, I can't do it. I'll just make it in the hard way if I got to.
Yeah.
And in the back of my mind, I was thinking I'm about ready to just stop and go back to school and become a licensed
2 years
plumber.
is up.
Yeah. And I don't know, 2 or 3 days later, he showed back up. He had an envelope with $500 in it, and he said, if you follow me out to my car. He handed it to me, and I was like, dude, I can't pay you back. There's no way. And he said, I don't want you to pay me back, but I want you to follow me out to my car. I'll book you a flight. You got to go try out. I'm like, who are you? And it was this guy named Will Farah. And I didn't know who he was. I had no idea what he was doing. And I was like, thank you, man. Yeah, I'll do what I can to pay you back. I don't want you to pay me back. I want you to go out there. And I was like,
wow.
All right.
That's
so
crazy.
That's what started. I went and tried out. I went and tried out, and I was in the interview, the same process as I went through a couple years earlier, and they said, what makes you different? Let me guess, like it's your last shot, right? It's your last shot to make it in the UFC. And I was like, no, it wasn't my last shot. I was like, nah, man, I just the only thing that makes me different from any of these other guys that maybe is that I overdosed and died on heroin September 9th, 2005. And if I stay sober for another couple of months, I'll have 4 years of continuous sobriety. I said, maybe that's the only thing that makes me different. And they were like, great, we like you. Get out of here. grabbed my bag, and I walked out, and they called me 2 days later when I was at home, and
Yeah.
they said, you made it on the show.
Yeah.
And then you won the whole entire thing.
I actually told them I wasn't coming.
What?
I hung up the phone, and I called this recovery guru, one of the people in my life.
Some guy with sage advice.
Yep, and I was like, dude, I can't go on this show. There's alcohol. And I said, what if I win it and become famous?
So
Then
for people
what?
listening, they know that you'd be in this house
Yep.
with other fighters,
Yep.
and they want
Unlimited alcohol. They want to
they want
cause
some
yep,
chaos and
reality
drama to
television.
happen,
Yep.
right?
Yep. And so he said, listen, Court, if you make it on that show, do you think you could possibly help somebody through your story that's struggling with addiction? And I was like, yeah, millions of people watch this show. And he's like, okay, do you think you could better financially provide for your family? I mean, that's what I wanted. And I was like, yeah, even if I make it on the show, my stock goes up in local venues. I'd be the main event all the time because I was the Ultimate Fighter guy, you know? And he said, well, what if you win it? And I was like, I guess you win a 6-figure contract, and then you get a contract in the UFC, and you're fighting the biggest stage in the world against the best guys in the world.
Yeah.
And he's like, well, maybe I ought to pray about it. So I said a little prayer. I didn't get anything from the prayer, but I was super sore. And so I took an Epsom salt bath, and I had a vision of me holding up the Ultimate Fighter trophy, and I knew that was my answer. So I went on the show, and 5 weeks later, I had made it into the finale. I came back home. I knew I was in the finale. I called my wife. I called that guy Will, and I was like, dude, I made it into the finale. And I wasn't supposed to tell anybody, but I was like, dude, don't tell anybody, but I made it into the finale. I'm fighting for the 6-figure contract. And he's like, I knew you would, buddy. I'm like, I'm proud of you, And I called my wife, and I was like, hey, I made it in. And she's like, oh, that's good. I knew you would. And she was like, by the way, we're pregnant. And so my second son was on the way because we tried. See, she wanted to have a kid earlier, but I knew I couldn't provide for 2 kids. And so I kind of had to hold off. And at the time, my youngest son was 2 years old. And I was like, I can't provide for him. And once I knew I was leaving for the house, I had this feeling that I was going to win it or life was going to change. And so we decided to try for a second kid.
Wow.
And so I came back with
Are you good at
Fighter
everything
news.
you do?
Seems to be.
I just feel lucky, Without a drink or drug, man, things change.
I didn't know it worked that way, but okay. Yeah.
Like I said,
I know how it works.
We're sitting next to Superman here.
So, yeah. And then, 6 weeks later, I got home. We didn't have coaches. The gym kind of switched up. And so I called Chuck Liddell, who was the coach on the season 11 Ultimate Fighter.
Yeah.
And I said, hey, I don't really have a coach. And he said, I'll call you back. And he called John Hackelman, his coach, and he decided he was going to fly me out there, let me stay at his house, give me a vehicle to drive to and from, and I was going to practice right next to him because his fight was a week before mine. The coaches were fighting a week before. Oh. I was fighting for the six-figure contract in the finale a week after. So I went out, I trained next to Chuck Liddell with a bunch of high-level guys, and I got ready for the biggest fight of my life. And in my mind, it wasn't the biggest fight of my life. I'd won the biggest fight of my life when I put that drink down April 16th, 2006.
Yeah.
And I'd made it through felony drug charges and felony burglary charges, and I made it through. And
Trial
so I
by
thought,
jury.
you know what, man, I've showed up to practice every day no matter what. I'll just show up for this one and do what I can. My eye got cut. I had 19 stitches under my eye a week before the fight.
Wow.
I had a doc clean it up, and I put some makeup on it. I went out to Las Vegas, and I was the main event that night, and I fought, and I won. And when I held up the trophy, he held the mic to me, and I said, I want to dedicate this fight to all those who are struggling. And ever since then, the McGee Project started. And that's the foundation that I started a few years ago, but it started on that day when I broke the stigma of addiction, and I decided to speak out as a person in long-term recovery. I dedicated my fight to all those who are struggling. And, 17 fights later, here I am in the UFC 9 years later, January 1st or 2nd when I fought my first fight to get in the house. I had 4 fights in the Ultimate Fighter house, all guys that had long careers in the UFC. They don't count those on my record, but I count those. Yeah. So that last fight that I had, UFC Fight Night Fort Lauderdale, was my 19th fight, 15th on their record or whatever, because they have to.
But see, this would all be amazing if your story just ended here. But you said you started the Court McGee Project, and now you're doing amazing things. I think a lot of people would look at you and go, you've done your work. sit back and enjoy. But that's not how Court McGee works.
No, I have a responsibility to share my story. Not only is it a huge part of my recovery, is giving back what was so freely given to me, but there's a guy, he was in his late 80s, and he said, son, when the highlight of your life is working with a drug addict and alcoholic at the lowest of their time, you'll be living pretty good. And that stuck with me. And so I've tried to mimic that. Not to mention that another was when I came out of my coma, and that role model with the solution gave me some suggestions to help me start my road to recovery. And it's like between those two guys and then all the experiences I had, I just kept doing that. I kept putting that first. And so I put recovery first, and everything that came second got put first class. All of a sudden, I was a father of two. You know, my first fight in the UFC, my son was in the NICU up until the day I left when he got out of the NICU, and I fought a week later.
Wow.
And it was one of the toughest fights of my life. I got my butt kicked the first round. I came back, and in the third round, I submitted him. And, you know, I've had all these fights, but I was like probably 5 years sober, you know, and I'm 13 years sober now. And I got a call from an undercover narcotics officer, left a message, and I got this message. And by this time, I had paid all my lawyer fees, court fines, restitution. I was completely off paper. I'd done 200 clean UAs. I had no more. I got out of the bad insurance that I had. Like, I had made it through all that stuff, and then I get a call from an undercover narcotics officer.
Freak you out?
Freaked me out. And I looked over to my wife, and I was like, Chelsea, what do I do?
And when they leave messages, they don't say what it's about, right? They're just like, give me a call.
This is Detective so-and-so. We need, we need you to call us back. And I was like, oh, my heart stopped.
I bet.
You know, because I've got that call before.
And you start thinking in your head, what did I do?
I was just like, oh, no, you know, and I hadn't been in any trouble. And I was like, honey, what do I do? And she's like, call him back. And I was like, okay.
Yeah, it makes sense.
So I called him back, and he said, hey, you know, this is Detective so-and-so. Hey, we're huge fans of yours. But I want you to know there was an officer the night you overdosed. He was involved in an officer accident. He's injured. He's off duty. But I'm putting on this program at the Utah State Capitol building, and it's this NADDI conference. It's for prescription narcotics, and I would love for you to be our speaker. Would you come up and share your story? Not to mention, I want to introduce you to the guy who was responsible for saving your life.
Wow.
And I was like, outside of sharing my story, I had shared my story in like recovery meetings and things like that, but I'd never really professionally shared my story or never shared it in public. I was open with my story, and I had done a ton of interviews, and I was always open with my recovery on interviews, saying I was in recovery. I was in long-term recovery. This is my experience. And so at the drop of a hat, I was like, yeah, I'll be there. Number one, I wanted to thank that guy. I wanted to give him a freaking kiss and a hug and tell him, man, I'm so thankful for you, and so is my family. And I shared my story, and it touched almost everybody in that room. And I was able to thank that officer and give him a big hug. And then after that, I was invited to speak at the Utah Anti-Narcotics Assembly, which is every undercover narcotics officer in the state of Utah. Not only one to inspire them that they were doing good work, but share my story of overcoming addiction so that they could see that somebody who really struggled can make it out. We're not all failures. And that we can make a difference if we're given an opportunity, which I was given multiple. So I went down and I shared, and there was a rural community sheriff working for a sheriff's department in Emery County that came up to me after, and he said, hey, I think your story would be perfect for our high school. There's kids struggling and drinking, and we have, you know, and nobody can really get to them, and there's no programs for that. Would you be willing to come speak? And at that time, I'd had a couple of fights, and I was about 2 weeks out. The time they wanted me to come down and speak to the 2 high schools and 2 junior highs, I was a week out from fighting at UFC Fight Night, Indianapolis, Indiana, and I was fighting Robert Whitaker, the current UFC middleweight champion. Biggest fight of my life. He wasn't the champion at the time, but I knew he was the biggest prospect out of Australia. And so I thought, okay, you know what? I got to do this. This is the number one thing. This has to come first. So I brought a friend with me. I did some training while I was out there, and I walked into Emory High School, and I shared my story for the first time to a high school audience. And I was met with some confliction. I remember the principal was like, we don't want a UFC fighter drug addict sharing to our kids. And the sheriff was like, you got to have him come talk to the kids. You have to. Mm-hmm. And he came up, and right before I went on, he was like, dude, don't screw this up. It might be my job. And so I went up, I shared my story, and everybody was silent, and they listened. And after it was over, I had hundreds and hundreds, like 600 kids come up to me and talk after.
Yeah.
And I had 2 or 3 that came up and shared their story that they were struggling. And I was able to offer some support and some suggestions, like that role model with a solution the night that I came out of my coma.
Giving back.
And from that point on, I was like, I got to continue to do this. I went out and I fought, and I beat Robert Whitaker 2 weeks later. Yeah. I came back home, and I continued to do that. And the McGee Project started that day. And
I think a lot of people don't understand. Like, you were preparing for a huge fight. Most people's mind would say, I can't be distracted with trying to give back or speak at a high school in Emery County. Like, maybe I can do that another time. I think people don't understand the level of professional preparation that goes into these sorts of fights. Yet you went out and did it, and were still able to maintain that focus and fight and win. And I think that in hearing your story and talking to you at other times, I know that connecting with people energizes you. Yep. Connecting with those kids really energized you that day. Isn't that right?
Yeah. I mean, I get asked before I go out, what do you fight for? Right when I'm in the tunnel, walking out in front of 20,000 people, getting ready to fight. What do you fight for? Find what you fight for. I know. I fight for those who are struggling out there to carry the message of hope and recovery. But once I started speaking in high school, see, there's roughly 23 million people in long-term recovery in the United States, and 90% of them started in their teenage years.
Yeah.
I reunited and married my high school sweetheart. Part of the sad side of my story is me and my 3 friends had one thing absolutely in common. All 3 of us would die of an accidental drug overdose, an opiate overdose. Only I was given a second chance, so I share their stories. Brady died on my 6-year sobriety birthday, and I was able to not only forgive him, but speak at his funeral. And most of the high schools I speak at, I wear a pair of boots. Those are his boots that his mother gave to me to wear.
Wow.
And Cody died last fall, my other friend, of an accidental drug overdose. 2 wonderful, incredible fathers, friends, fishermen, talented people that couldn't get a grips on their addiction. They couldn't achieve recovery, and they were lost, but they're not forgotten because I share my story, and I help break the silence of opioid addiction. I help break down some of the stigma by speaking up, because people suffer in silence. I didn't want to ask for help, and I was met with all these obstacles, but I continued to speak up and share my story. And every time I spoke up, even though I was met with obstacles, there was solutions that I found from that. And it's incredible. I've spoken at hundreds and hundreds of high schools. As a matter of fact, this will be our first annual juvenile justice tour for the 4 main juvenile justice facilities here in Utah, and that starts in June. I have all 4 facilities in June that I'll be touring and speaking at, creating hope and inspiration for those kids who are stuck in the criminal justice system.
And I'm so excited about that, because most of those kids, they're 13, 14, 15 years old. These teenagers have never had somebody many of them have never had somebody to be a role model.
Idolize.
And inspire them. Yeah, somebody who can idolize, but they can relate to. You've been in that system, and you've had these experiences, and you've gotten through it. And having had some experience working with those kids myself, I understand that so many of them are just desperate, waiting for that connection with somebody. And that's one of the reasons I was so excited to have you on the show today, to talk about this part of your story.
And see, that's what I like, because, when you said when you met that first guy in the hospital that in 5 minutes you knew he'd seen what you've seen, and you could sympathize and you could recognize a lot of the stuff he is. And I think that you're going to be able to give that back with the youth of Utah and around the world. So what does the McGee Project look like today?
So we've traveled to 6 different states. I speak in high schools all over, alternative high schools, juvenile justice. I speak for the Mark Wahlberg Youth Foundation and DEA 360, the youth opioid awareness summits that are great big, 5 to 10,000 students. I present at those. And it's like incredible because when I was in high school, there wasn't an assembly put on that talked about addiction from first-person perspective. It was always law enforcement saying, don't do this. It was always a teacher or a principal or
a cheesy video.
Or a cheesy video. Never from oh, this guy experienced it and made it out and he talked about it. And not only that, but I drank in high school because I thought it would be fun. And I can make recovery look attractive because I have fished all over the world, and I've done that sober. I have fought some of the best guys in the world. You know, like I've done all these incredible things, and I've done them sober, and it's a blast. Like I love my life today. I became a father, you know, a husband, a professional athlete, and now a professional speaker. And so the McGee Project, it not only educates students, not necessarily who struggle, but encourages them and educates them. But the kids who are starting to struggle or are starting to have issues or have tried, I can get them an education based on my personal experience of where drug addiction can take them and how fast it can take them.
Yeah, because you escalated quick.
Very quick.
Yeah, that's a unique thing, or maybe I don't know how unique it is necessarily, but I think it's unique. We usually hear about months and years of a person using until it eventually, and yours was like, boom.
Yeah.
In 1 year, you were hooked.
And lost everything. Yeah. Lost absolutely everything. And so I put a presentation together. I meet with counselors. I have a whole curriculum. And so we coach the counselors and the principal and faculty, and then we put it on Canvas, and then all the students know that Court McGee's coming and the McGee Project's coming, and then we put on an assembly, and every student shows up, and then I put on a presentation. I have a short film that lets them know a little bit of my story, and then they get on and I share a portion of my story to help educate people on addiction, to help break some of the stigma surrounding addiction, and then to help motivate kids who are already starting to use or even struggling a way out and giving them direction and purpose. And then kids come forward after, and some of them need help, and I'm in a position to where I have a good group of people around us at the McGee Project where we can help each individual kid, and we can introduce them to people that can help them. Licensed clinical social workers, counselors.
Wow.
With treatment. We're a 501c3 nonprofit, and it's the best thing I've ever done, and it's the most powerful thing I've ever done. I just got back from Washington D.C. The congressional offices. I met with both of our state senators here in Utah, Senator Romney and Senator Lee, and I was able to talk and work together with them on helping break some of the stigma surrounding addiction, and then talk about my project, as well as partnering with Facebook SOS. They did a short documentary film. If anybody's on Facebook, you're going to see it. It's all over the place now. Yep. They did these short films from 12 different stories of 12 people from the hardest hit states in the country. And here in Utah, we're one of the hardest hit states of accidental drug overdose and deaths.
Yeah. Well, Court, thank you very much for sharing your story, being honest and being raw, and congratulations on all your success and what you're doing to change people's lives. One last question, because your story is so amazing. It almost sounds like a Disney movie. So if they were to make a movie about you, what actor do you want to play you?
Ooh. I don't know, because I don't know anybody who looks like me, but maybe like Josh Brolin or Mark Wahlberg.
There you go. Hey, if people want more information about you, where do they go?
So you can go to our website, the McGee Project website. It's McGeeProject.org. So McGeeProject.org.
Awesome. And you've been listening to Project Recovery, a podcast about addiction, but more importantly, recovery. My name is Casey Scott, and if you know somebody who needs some help, have them do what I did and give Pinnacle Recovery Center a call and start their road to recovery. Dr. Matt, anything?
I'm just inspired, and I love the fact that the McGee Project helps kids. That's where we need to get in and intervene. Early intervention, that's the key.
And you've been listening to Project Recovery, a KSL podcast. Who wants a tickle fight?
Not me. I'll lose.